Woman returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. Sophie never expected her life to end like this. It was an ordinary evening, the kind where the minutes slipped by unnoticed. She had just finished cleaning the kitchen, the scent of lemon-scented cleaner lingering in the air. The soft hum of the dishwasher was the only sound breaking the silence. She felt a slight headache creep along the edge of her skull, but she ignored it, assuming it was just another long day catching up with her. But then, without warning, pain struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. A searing, unbearable pressure exploded behind her eyes, sending her to her knees. The world around her tilted violently, and a wave of nausea overtook her. She tried to call out, to reach for her phone, but her limbs no longer obeyed her commands. A strange numbness spread through her body, her vision blurring, her hearing fading in and out like a flickering radio signal. She collapsed onto the cold tile floor, her breathing shallow and uneven. The ceiling above her darkened, the edges of her vision closing in. She could hear the distant sound of a siren. Had someone called for help? Was her husband home? She couldn't remember. A terrifying thought crept into her mind. Is this how it ends? Then everything went silent. The pain was gone. The heaviness in her body had disappeared. Sophie took a deep breath, but something felt different. Lighter. Free. She opened her eyes, but the world had changed. She was no longer on the kitchen floor. Instead, she found herself standing, floating, above her own body. The sight below her was surreal, like watching a scene from a movie. Paramedics were rushing in, her husband standing frozen in the doorway, his face drained of all color. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him she was okay, but when she moved, it wasn't like moving in the physical sense. It was effortless, like gliding through water without resistance. A strange calm settled over her. Shouldn't she be panicking, fighting to get back into her body? But something deep inside whispered that this was just the beginning of something far greater than she could comprehend. Then she saw it, a light in the distance. It wasn't just any light. It was warm, golden, and pulsing like it was alive. Unlike the fluorescent hospital lights below her, this light called to her, wrapping around her like a melody she had known her whole life but had never heard until now. The pull was irresistible. Without hesitation, she moved toward it, leaving behind the scene of her own emergency. The closer she got, the more the light grew, until it swallowed everything else. And then, suddenly, she was there. Sophie gasped as she took in her surroundings. It was breathtaking. The sky was a deep, endless gold, filled with swirling colors that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was thick with something indescribable. Not just warmth, not just peace, but a presence. A feeling of being known, completely and without question. The ground beneath her feet shimmered, not quite solid, but not quite air. She could feel it, but it didn't weigh her down. Flowers bloomed in colors beyond anything she had ever seen, their petals almost glowing. A soft wind blew, carrying whispers that sounded like laughter, music, and love all at once. She knew where she was. Somehow, without anyone telling her, she knew. This was not a dream. This was real. Then, movement in the distance. Figures. They were glowing, indistinct but unmistakably alive. Sophie took a hesitant step forward, but before she could say anything they moved aside, parting like a sea. And then she saw him. He stood at the center of it all, his presence brighter than anything else in this radiant realm. He didn't glow like the other figures. He was the light. The very air around him hummed with an energy Sophie could feel deep in her soul. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking him. Jesus. She fell to her knees, overcome with awe. Tears filled her eyes, though she didn't feel sadness. It was something else. something she couldn't put into words. Jesus took a step toward her, his expression filled with love and understanding. He reached out a hand, lifting her gently to her feet. "Sophie," he said, his voice carrying not just sound but meaning. It was warm, kind, but filled with something deeper, a weight, an urgency. "You are here for a reason." She blinked, her mind racing. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Am I dead?" Jesus smiled, though there was something solemn behind his eyes. "Not yet. But before you return, there is something you must see." A chill ran through Sophie, despite the warmth of the golden light. She wasn't sure she wanted to see what he meant, but something inside her told her she had no choice. And with that, the golden sky began to shift, the light swirling into something new. The beautiful realm faded, replaced by something else, something vast, something uncertain, something important. The light around Sophie began to shift, transforming into something fluid, like golden smoke twisting and reshaping itself into something new. The warmth of the realm still surrounded her, but a strange sensation crept into her chest. An awareness that something was about to be revealed, something beyond anything she had ever imagined. Jesus stood beside her, his presence unwavering, his gaze fixed on the shifting light ahead. Sophie followed his gaze, unsure of what she was about to see, but she knew, deep in her soul, that it would change her forever. Then the golden mist cleared, and suddenly she was no longer in the radiant realm. She was somewhere else. She stood above the earth, as though suspended in space, but not in the cold, empty void of the universe. This was something different. The earth below her shimmered with energy, pulsing like a living thing. She could see the swirling blues of the oceans, the vast greens of forests, and the bright, flickering lights of the cities. It was breathtaking. But as she watched, something changed. A darkness began to seep across the planet, not like a shadow cast by the sun, but something alive. It spread through the streets, curling around buildings, creeping into homes. It wasn't a physical darkness, it was something else. Fear, division, deception. Sophie felt it like a weight pressing on her chest, thick and suffocating. Her eyes darted to Jesus. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jesus turned to her, his expression calm but serious. "It is the battle unseen, the forces that shape the hearts of humanity. Light and darkness have always existed, but now the scales are shifting." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. She could feel it, the tension, the unrest. She saw people arguing in the streets, families turning against each other, leaders standing at podiums, their words twisting like vines, wrapping around those who listened. She saw confusion, people searching for answers but being misled by voices that sought to divide rather than unite. But then, among the shifting darkness, Sophie saw something, or someone, standing at a crossroads. A single figure surrounded by unseen forces. It was a woman. Tall, poised, elegant. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her instantly. Melania Trump. The former First Lady stood at the center of it all, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped in front of her as though waiting for something. Around her, the unseen forces moved, some whispering in her ear, others trying to pull her in different directions. Some were cloaked in light, others in shadow. Sophie's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what she was seeing, but she knew it was important. She turned to Jesus. Why her? Jesus' eyes never left the scene. Because her role is not yet understood. She carries more influence than the world realizes. Sophie's mind raced. Melania had always been a mysterious figure to the public, graceful, reserved, often silent while others spoke around her. But here, in this vision, Sophie saw something more. There was an energy around her, a weight she carried, something hidden beneath the surface. "She stands at a turning point," Jesus continued. "The forces around her seek to shape the future through her. Some wish to use her to bring truth and healing. Others seek to use her to spread deception." The storm of forces around Melania intensified. The ones cloaked in shadow whispered more insistently, while the ones in light reached for her, their movements urgent. Sophie's stomach twisted. "But she's not in power anymore," she said. "She's no longer First Lady. How can she still be so important?" Jesus turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight Sophie could feel deep in her bones. Power is not always where the world expects it to be. The words struck her like a lightning bolt. It wasn't just about holding a title or standing behind a podium. Influence didn't fade just because someone was out of the public eye. Sometimes the most powerful shifts happen behind closed doors, away from cameras, in whispers rather than speeches. Sophie's mind reeled as she watched the forces around Melania clash. One moment, she seemed to lean toward the light, her eyes filled with something close to clarity. But then the shadows whispered again, and doubt flickered across her face. "She doesn't know," Sophie murmured. "She doesn't see what's happening around her." Jesus nodded. "Few do." Sophie's chest tightened. She wanted to reach out, to warn Melania, to tell her to be careful, to choose wisely. But she couldn't. She was only a witness, trapped in this vision, watching history unfold in ways most would never see. The scene shifted again. This time, Sophie saw a future, one that had yet to be written. Two paths stretched before Melania, but Sophie could not see where they led. She only knew that the decision was coming, and that it would matter, more than anyone could understand. The golden mist began to swirl around Sophie again, pulling her away from the vision. Her heart pounded in her chest as the earth faded, replaced by the radiant light of the realm once more. She turned to Jesus, her mind filled with questions. "What do I do with this? How can I—" Jesus raised a hand, silencing her gently. "Watch. Pray. Tell them to remember." The words echoed in Sophie's soul, vibrating through her like a bell ringing in an empty chamber. The vision was over, but its weight would stay with her forever. The golden realm around Sophie began to waver, the light shimmering like ripples on the surface of a lake. She felt it before she saw it, something pulling at her, a force she could not resist. The warmth of Jesus' presence remained, but there was a shift, a change in the air around her. She knew what was coming. She was being sent back. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not yet." Jesus stood before her, his expression filled with both compassion and certainty. There was no doubt in his eyes, no hesitation. "It is time," he said gently. Sophie's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to beg for more time, to ask more questions. The vision of Melania Trump still burned in her mind. The storm around her, the whispers pulling at her, the weight of a choice she might not even know she had to make. Sophie had seen something most people would never see, and now she was being asked to return to a world that would never believe her. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. "How can I make anyone understand?" Jesus' gaze softened. Truth is not always understood immediately. It is a seed. You must plant it and trust that it will grow. Sophie swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "Will she make the right choice?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Jesus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past Sophie as if gazing into something she couldn't see. Then he spoke, his voice steady. The future is never set in stone. It bends with every choice, every action, every moment of faith or doubt. But the forces of light never cease to call. The words settled over her like a weight, filling her with both urgency and responsibility. The world was shifting, forces were moving, and time was running out. But it wasn't too late. It was never too late. Sophie felt the pull again, stronger this time. The golden light around her twisted, fading into something darker, heavier. She gasped. Pain, cold, noise. She was back. Her eyes snapped open, and the world came rushing back all at once. The beeping of machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the distant hum of voices just beyond her room. A dull, throbbing ache pulsed through her head, her limbs feeling as though they were filled with lead. She was in a hospital. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to process what had happened. Had it been real? Had she truly left her body? Had she truly stood in a place where time and space meant nothing, where Jesus himself had spoken to her? She turned her head slightly, wincing at the effort, and saw her husband sitting beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes were red, his face drawn with exhaustion. The moment he saw her stir, his head shot up, his breath hitching in his throat. "Sophie?" His voice cracked. She swallowed, her throat dry and raw. "I'm here," she whispered. Tears filled his eyes. He grabbed her hand, pressing it to his lips as he let out a shaky breath. "You scared me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were gone, Sophie. They said you might not wake up." Gone. The word sent a chill down her spine. She had been gone. The memory of the radiant realm flooded her mind, along with the urgency of the message she had been given. She had seen something she was never supposed to see, something that could change everything, if only people would listen. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. Would they listen? Would anyone believe her? The weight of it pressed down on her like an anchor, suffocating and overwhelming. She thought about Melania, about the storm, about the choice hanging in the balance. It felt too big for her, too much for one person to carry. Her husband squeezed her hand. "It's okay," he said, misreading the look on her face. "You're safe now." Sophie wasn't sure that was true. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. Jesus had told her the truth was a seed. She didn't have to convince the world all at once. She just had to plant it, and she would, no matter the cost. Sophie sat up in her hospital bed, her mind racing as the beeping of machines and the hushed voices of nurses outside her door faded into the background. The weight of what she had seen, the vision of the world, the darkness creeping in, and Melania Trump standing at the center of a storm, pressed down on her like an invisible force. The message Jesus had given her was clear. The world was at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming years would shape the future in ways most could not comprehend. But now, back in the physical world, the enormity of it all felt suffocating. Her husband sat beside her, still holding her hand as though afraid to let go. His eyes were filled with love and relief, but also with a hint of something else: concern. Sophie knew that whatever she said next would change everything. She had seen something no one else had. She had been sent back for a reason. She had to tell him. But the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make him understand that while her body had been lying unconscious in this hospital bed, she had been somewhere else? That she had stood before Jesus and been given a message that would change everything? She took a shaky breath. "David," she whispered. Her voice was weak, and the rawness in her throat made speaking painful, but she pushed through it. "Something happened to me." His grip on her hand tightened. "I know," he said gently. "You had an aneurysm, Sophie. You almost—" He swallowed hard, unable to say the word. She shook her head. "No," she said, her voice more urgent now. "I left." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She took another breath, steadying herself. "I mean, I wasn't here, David. I was somewhere else. I saw things that I can't explain, and I spoke to him." His face was unreadable. "Who?" Her throat tightened. "Jesus." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. David blinked, his expression shifting between shock, skepticism, and something else. Fear. "Sophie," he said slowly, his voice careful. "You were in a coma. Your brain went through something traumatic. Maybe it was a dream, or—" "It wasn't a dream." Her voice was stronger now, more certain. "I was there, David, and he told me something about the world, about the future, and about her." His brow furrowed. "Her?" She hesitated. This was the part that scared her the most, because even if he believed she had some kind of spiritual experience, this was what would make people question everything. "Melania Trump," she said, watching his reaction closely. David pulled back slightly, confusion flashing across his face. "Melania Trump?" He said her name like it was completely out of place in this conversation. "Sophie, why would Jesus talk to you about Melania Trump?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I saw her. She was at the center of something massive. There were forces around her, pulling her in different directions. Some wanted her to see the truth, others wanted to deceive her, and she—" Sophie shook her head. "She doesn't know. She doesn't understand how much is at stake." David let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Sophie, listen. You've been through something huge. You almost died. It's natural for your brain to—" She grabbed his hand, holding it tight. "David, please," she begged. "I need you to listen to me. I don't expect you to understand, and I don't even expect you to believe me. But I know what I saw, and I was sent back for a reason." His jaw tensed, but he didn't pull away. "And what reason is that?" he asked softly. "To tell people," she said. "To warn them." He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. His expression was torn. He wanted to believe her, she could see it, but the logical part of him, the rational, grounded part, was fighting it. Sophie didn't blame him. If the roles were reversed, she wasn't sure she'd believe it either. But that didn't change the truth. The next few days passed in a blur of tests, doctor visits, and physical therapy. Sophie's body was healing, but her mind was restless. She felt like she was running out of time, like she had been given a ticking clock and didn't know how much sand was left in the hourglass. She had to start somewhere. So she told her sister, then her closest friends, then eventually a small group from her church. The reactions were mixed. Some people listened intently, nodding as though they could feel the truth in her words. Others looked at her with quiet skepticism, their eyes filled with polite doubt, and some outright dismissed her, saying that near-death experiences were just the brain's way of processing trauma. But Sophie didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had been given this message for a reason, and whether people believed her or not, she had to speak. Soon, word spread. Someone invited her to speak at a small gathering at a local community center. Then a church in another town. Then a journalist reached out, intrigued by her story. The more she talked, the more the message rippled outward, reaching people she never expected. But she was careful. She didn't claim to know everything. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She only told people what she knew, what she had seen. That the world was at a turning point. That unseen forces were at work in ways most people couldn't comprehend. That Melania Trump, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, was at the heart of something bigger than anyone realized. And that people needed to pray, to watch, to remember. She didn't know if her message would reach the right people. She didn't know if Melania herself would ever hear it. But she did know that she had done what she was sent back to do. And as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would not stop speaking the truth.